In this lesson, we'll learn how to use the Quick Selection tool as well as the Magic Wand tool here inside of Photoshop. Okay, great. So I've got the Lesson 13 Begin file open in front of me here. If you want to open that up, by all means, go ahead. So in this particular file, I've got a couple of different examples, but in the last lesson we learned what selections are and why they're important, and we learned how we can begin to make some basic selections using the Marquee selection tools as well as the Lasso selection tools. Now, those aren't the only tools. There's a couple of tools that really can produce some more advanced selections, and the first of which is going to be the Quick Selection tool. You can see that I actually have it currently selected here in my tool panel, and the keyboard shortcut for this tool is W. So if I were to hit V on my keyboard to go to the selection tool, I can hit W on my keyboard to go to the Quick Selection tool. Now, with this tool, we're going to use it first to select the entire background here around our crab. Now, this tool, again, works very similar to the Marquee and Lasso tools in the fact that we have just different selection modes up here. You can see here with this first one, this is simply referred to as making a new selection. We can add to a selection, and we can subtract from a selection. So we'll come in and make a new selection here, and I'm simply going to click and drag. Now you can kind of see here how exactly that works. Obviously, nothing really happened there. I made a selection and it disappeared. Why is that? Well, the reason for that is I have my paint layer selected right now, and this particular tool is only looking at the selected layer right now in terms of what it selects. So why don't you come up here with me and go ahead and click on this Sample All Layers box. And now when we come in and begin to sort of draw in a selection around our crab, let's just come in here and start down here. You can see how that works. Now, I've honestly added to a selection here, and you can see that, well, it's done pretty good on the bottom portion around the edges of our crab. Up here around the top, it's sort of trimmed off the top of his shell. So we can actually come in here and subtract from a quick selection, just like we did in the last lesson. So by holding down the Alt key, we can come in here and begin to subtract from that selection. You can see my selection mode is switched to subtract from right there. And we can just kind of shave that selection back some. Now you want to be really careful. There are some little bitty selected areas right in here, so I'm going to just run that over one more time. But for the most part, that's done a pretty fair job of making this selection. Now at this point, if we wanted to, we could come in here and maybe grab our brush tool again. If we wanted to maybe paint just the background around without painting on the original image, we could come in and begin to paint that in sort of like that. And we'll just kind of paint this in. This will be a nice contrast to that white background. And if we deselect this now by hitting Control D, you can see how good a job that really did in getting rid of the white background. Now, granted, this is a pretty high contrast image in terms of the background and the subject of the image. It was pretty easy to select that white background. But if we came over here, let's go ahead and undo. And you can see here, there's our selection again. And I'll just hit the Delete key, which is going to delete all that paint that I put in. Now, maybe we want to actually utilize the silhouette of the crab, but it was easier to come in and select this background. And then what we can actually do is jump up here under the Select menu and invert our selection. So you can see the keyboard shortcut for this is Control-Shift-I, and that would invert the selection. So now instead of the background being selected, we have our crab selected. We could come in here and just paint his little silhouette, just like so. And deselect that, and there we go. So you can see how easy that was. So think outside the box when you're making a selection like that. If you need a silhouette of something, but it's easier to select the area around the subject and just invert the selection to get to exactly what you're after. Now, again, this is the Quick Selection tool. Let me hit Control A to select all, and I'll just delete that paint that we put in. Now, at this point, I'm also going to go down here and hide our toy crab layer. And we've got this flower here. So I wanted to use this image because there's quite a bit more variation in terms of color here. Now, with this image, let's go ahead and hit the Shift key on our keyboard and then W. And that's going to switch us to the next tool we're talking about here. This is the Magic Wand tool. And again, it's got those same 4 buttons up here that we learned about in the last lesson in order to sort of control the selection mode, whether we're adding to, subtracting from, or creating an intersecting selection. But the way this tool works is based on color. So basically, the first thing we should probably do is think about if we want this to take a point sample, which means it's going to sample exactly the pixel where we click it, or we can tell it to create sort of a bigger sample, maybe a 3 pixel by 3 pixel average and select based on that, or even a larger average here. So maybe we go with something like an 11 by 11 average. Now, the next thing we have access to for this particular tool is a tolerance setting, and this is going to control how strict or lenient the selection is. So if we come in here with a tolerance set to 40 and maybe click on this area right here, you can see the selection that was made, again based on that 11 by 11 average. Now, if we were to deselect that, and let's ramp this up to something like 100, something a bit more forgiving, and we click on this same area again, you're going to see that quite a bit more information gets selected here. As a matter of fact, it selected most of the pinkish red areas in our flower. Now, there are some other options here that you should probably be familiar with. So anti-alias basically means that Photoshop is going to add a little bit of transparency around some of the edges of the selection so that we don't get essentially a little jagged stair-stepping pattern from the pixels. Contiguous means that basically we're limiting our selection to only areas where the affected colors touch. So in the example we've got here with this particular image, if we did not have this contiguous selected, and there was some of that same pinkish red over here, maybe in another flower, then this selection would also pick up on that over there. So contiguous is going to keep our selection on just the area we're targeting. And again, of course, sample all layers, we know exactly what that means. So the refine edge button here, we're actually going to learn about a little later in this course because it also is very similar to some features that are available when we learn about masking. So we're going to learn about that in just a little while. But for right now, let me go ahead and deselect this. And I'm going to switch back to our quick selection tool by hitting Shift W. So with that tool selected, again, sampling all layers, we can come in here, and one thing I did not point out to you is with this tool, we have a brush that dictates kind of the area we're painting to make a selection. So you can see right now my brush size is very small. You can see just I have a simple little dot for my mouse cursor. It's actually a 16 pixel brush, but we can click that little arrow right there, and we can begin to adjust the size of the brush. Now, the hardness here is going to affect the edges of our brush. So if this was the tip of our brush right here, this round circle, the hardness is going to affect the edge of that brush. So a soft edge is going to look a little bit more gradated, whereas a hard edge is going to be a nice crisp circle. So with the hardness turned all the way up, we'll go ahead and ramp up the size slider just a little bit here. Spacing is just going to control essentially the amount of space between each brush tip strike on our canvas. So as we make a stroke along our canvas, whether it's with a brush or whether it's with an eraser, or in this case, the quick selection tool, that brush head or brush tip makes several stamps along the stroke. Now, spacing controls the distance between those stamps. So in this case, we'll leave it kind of where it is right now, but I do have my pin pressure turned on, so I can paint really lightly with this quick selection tool, or I can paint very heavy, and that's going to affect the selection I'm painting here. So you can see here this quick selection tool, if we just wanted to select this flower, is making quick work of that compared to the Magic Wand tool, which is again is using color to make this selection. So we're just going to come along here just like so and kind of make some selections around in there. And again, I'm just adding to that selection just like so. Now, one thing I want to point out to you with this quick selection tool, you can see when your brush is a little bit large, you can have a tendency to run over some areas maybe that you don't want to select. Again, we can come in and just shrink that brush size down. And again, I'm going to go with something fairly small, maybe around 20 pixels or so. 15 or 20 should work. And I'm just going to hold down the Alt key, and I'm going to run it right there in that little crack between those two leaves. We can do the same thing right here. And if we get into the leaves a little bit, we can hold Shift to add to the selection. So again, in this case, if we wanted to come in here, we've actually selected our flower. If we wanted to paint the background, we would need to invert the selection. Again, we could use Control-Shift-I to do that. And then let's grab our paintbrush here, and we'll just simply paint in our black color here. Just kind of isolate this, this pretty flower on a black background. Just like so. And we'll hit Control-D to deselect that. And you can see what kind of quick work the Quick Selection tool really made out of selecting only the petals in this flower. Really, overall, it's a very clean selection. You can't really see any of that green background through around the edges. So in this lesson, we've learned about the Quick Selection tool and the Magic Wand tool, and how we can begin to make more complex, advanced selections using these two tools. Now, there's really only one other type of selection that I want to teach you in this course, and we're actually going to be looking at that in the next lesson. We're going to learn about quick selections and how we can make those in Quick Mask mode.